They always knock politely the first time. I sat in the same armchair I've sat in for decades, an antique velvet thing with fading embroidery and iron legs that have outlived 3 renovations. The teacup in my hand was nearly empty, the dregs swirling like secrets, when I heard the sound, a gentle knock on the front door of the manor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I didn't turn my head. I didn't need to. Alice, my housekeeper of 20 years, would open it. She'd let the girl in, the one I agreed to speak to for reasons I still didn't fully understand. Young, ambitious, maybe a little too bright-eyed for her own good. A journalist from some digital outlet I hadn't heard of before. She wrote human interest stories, apparently. Stories. She wanted mine. I want to talk to you about your legacy, she'd written in her email. Your work in the legal system. The foundation. The awards. But I don't care for awards. What I care about is truth. And sometimes, truth takes 70 years to find its voice. Ms. Eleanor Thorne? The girl stepped in as if she were entering a church. I could hear the reverence in her voice. My house makes people feel small. That's not by accident. She had that nervous rhythm to her footsteps, trying not to scuff the hardwood, trying not to breathe too loudly. I looked up slowly. Let her see me as I am. Old. Gray. Wrinkled with years that don't just measure time, they measure silence. The kind of silence that poisons from the inside. The kind that pretends to be strength, but is really just a well-sealed cage. You came, I said, setting down the cup. Good. She smiled with all her teeth, clutching her little recorder. I can't tell you what an honor this is. I've followed your career. You've been a hero to so many. I raised a hand. Stop. She blinked. I didn't invite you here to be worshipped. I invited you here because I'm done being a ghost. Her smile faltered. I gestured to the chair across from me. She sat, fumbled with the recorder, pressed a button that made a soft click. Are you ready? She asked. I nodded, though I already knew she wasn't. No one ever is. I'm going to start with the beginning, I said, folding my hands on my lap. Not the one you read in the papers. Not the part where I graduated top of my class, or the part where I dismantled entire corporations with a single court case. I looked her dead in the eyes. I'm going to start with the real beginning. The part I've never spoken aloud. Not to my friends. Not even to God. She swallowed. Okay. I breathed in. Long and slow. The breath of someone who's held something in for too long. It was 1959, I began. I was 11 years old. My mother died that morning. An aneurysm, they said. She collapsed in the kitchen while making tea. I found her. Her lips were blue. The teapot shattered on the floor. The girl said nothing. Good. Let silence make room for the dead. They buried her quickly. Catholic customs. Black dresses. Men with hats in their hands pretending to pray. My grandfather stood beside me at the gravesite, a hand on my shoulder. He told me I'd be okay. He told me I was brave. I leaned back. That night, he sent everyone else home. My father was away, some business trip. My grandmother said she was tired and went to bed. And then it was just me. And him. My voice trembled, just once. He told me to come to the den. That he'd read to me, the way Mother used to. He lit a fire. Poured himself a drink. I sat there thinking I was lucky. Thinking I still had someone. I stared at the girl, and her recorder blinked with a tiny red light, catching every word. That was the night he locked the door. That was the night he took everything from me. He called it love. I called it death. I bled all over his leather chair. She looked horrified. Pale. I could see the questions behind her eyes. Why now? Why me? Why are you saying this? Don't ask me why I never spoke of it, I said quietly. I was a child. And he was powerful. Wealthy. Respected. His photograph still hangs in some courthouse downtown. They named a library after him once. I smiled bitterly. I made a decision that night not to die. I didn't want to be buried beside my mother, not yet. I decided to survive. And if I survived, I would rise so high, so far above him, that one day, when the world was watching, I would tell them the truth. The girl leaned forward, stunned into silence. I looked toward the window, where sunlight fell across the dust in golden beams. And that day, I whispered, is today. She didn't say a word for several minutes. The girl, Emma, I think her name was, just sat there with her fingers pressed against her recorder, as though afraid the sound of her own breath might shatter what she'd just heard. I don't blame her. Some stories bruise on the way out. It was after midnight, I continued, folding my hands tightly together. The house was quiet. Too quiet. My grandmother had retired upstairs. She never liked to intervene. Not in grief, not in conflict, not even in cruelty. She believed a man ruled his home, and a child was to be shaped, not heard. I paused and traced the rim of my teacup, though it had long since gone cold. My grandfather poured himself another drink. Whiskey. I remember the smell. I didn't understand it then. I just knew it made his breath hot. Sour. He sat me on his lap and told me he would take care of me now. That I was his little one. That God had taken my mother so I could become a woman sooner. I let the words hang in the air like smoke. Emma's fingers twitched on her notebook. Her eyes were glassy now, not from pity, but from fury. Good. Fury was honest. More honest than sympathy. You bled, she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded. I bled, and he told me it was normal. That it was proof I was becoming a woman. I bled again 2 nights later, and I remember scrubbing the stains from the cushion until my hands turned raw. I begged the housemaid not to tell anyone. She never looked me in the eyes again. She swallowed. Did no one suspect anything? No one in the family. They suspected, I said bitterly. They just didn't want to know. That was how things were back then. If a man had wealth, reputation, and a pew in the church, then he was above suspicion. And I was just a girl who cried too much after her mother died. Emma clenched her jaw. Her recorder was still running. I tried to run once, I added. That winter. I packed a little bag and made it as far as the train station. But I didn't have money or identification. A station guard stopped me and called the house. My grandfather picked me up. That night, he made me promise never to run again. I could feel the ridges of old pain stir in my bones, as if my body remembered more than I allowed it to. He gave me a ribbon for my hair that night. Red satin. I buried it in the garden the next day. Emma looked at me with wet eyes. Why now? She asked. Why tell this story now? I met her gaze evenly. Because I am old, I said. Because he is long dead. And because before I go, I want to make sure the truth doesn't die with me. For 70 years, I wore silence like a medal. People called me strong because I never cried, never faltered. But strength is not silence. I leaned in, lowering my voice. Strength is remembering and choosing to speak. She nodded slowly. I want you to write the story, I said. But not the version you came here for. Not the polished legend of Eleanor Thorne, judge of the century. I want the world to know how Eleanor was born not from power, but from pain. She was silent for a moment. Then, carefully, she asked, what happened after? Did he stop? My smile was sharp. Cold. No, I said. He didn't stop. But I started to change. I learned to lie better than he could. I learned to play the obedient granddaughter while listening to every whisper behind every closed door. I kept records. I kept receipts. And I waited. Emma looked stunned. You waited for what? For the right time, I said. To burn him down from the inside. She stared at me like I was speaking another language. You don't live with that kind of pain for 7 decades and stay the same, I whispered. I became something else. Something sharp. And the older he got, the weaker he became. I sat back, letting the fire crackle beside us, warming the shadows creeping into the corners of the room. He taught me what cruelty looks like, I said. And I taught myself what vengeance feels like. The girl leaned forward again, voice barely above a whisper. What did you do to him? I smiled. That, I said, is chapter 3. The first time I wished someone dead, I was 12. I don't say that with shame. Children aren't meant to carry such thoughts, I know, but I wasn't just a child anymore. He had taken that from me. What remained was something harder, something colder. I hadn't grown up, I had grown sharp. That morning, I looked into the bathroom mirror and saw blood on my nightgown again. My skin was raw from scrubbing it clean, my eyes hollow. I remember brushing my hair and hearing the whisper in my head, "You have to survive. You have to outlast him." It wasn't a prayer. It was a command. He smiled at me over breakfast that day, asked me how I'd slept. I didn't answer. I poured his tea with steady hands. That was the first time I understood what power could look like when wrapped in sweetness. My mother had always said kindness was a virtue, but I was learning something different. Kindness without justice was just cowardice in a prettier dress. I swore to myself that morning, before I even knew what the word revenge truly meant, that one day he would pay. And not just him, everyone who looked away. Everyone who left me bleeding while they smiled through Sunday Mass. They would all feel it. Every single one. Emma hadn't blinked since I started speaking. You were just 12, she asked softly. 12 when I made the vow, I said. But 13 when I made my first move. She leaned in. What did you do? I let out a breath, slow and steady. I began to watch. My grandfather thought himself untouchable like all predators do. He believed his power, his charm, his money made him invisible. But monsters grow arrogant. They forget that even a small girl can become a threat when she's invisible too. I paid attention to his business meetings, to the girls who visited his office, to the ones who never came back a second time. Emma looked sick. You think there were others? There were dozens, I said flatly. Most of them poor. Some of them barely older than I was. He had an eye for weakness, a nose for desperation, and a way of convincing the world that he was a savior. I stared at my hands. Still strong, despite the years. These hands had signed documents that ruined empires, but once they were just small fists pressed against a locked door. I started hiding things, I went on. Letters, receipts, business ledgers. I memorized names. Recorded snippets of conversations when tape recorders first came out. I made it my religion. I was careful, so careful. Because if he knew, he would have ended me. Emma's voice cracked. But weren't you still vulnerable? Yes, I said. But I learned to weaponize obedience. I became the golden girl. Polite, poised, perfect grades. Never raised my voice. I made him believe he'd broken me, that I adored him, that I wanted to be just like him. She shook her head in disbelief. That must have been hell. It was, I said simply. But I had a reason to endure it. My promise. My decision. She stared into the fireplace, where the flames snapped and curled like angry tongues. Did you ever tell anyone? A friend? A teacher? I shook my head. They wouldn't have believed me. Or worse, they would have pitied me. And I didn't want pity. I wanted justice. And I was willing to wait decades for it. Emma glanced at her recorder again, then back at me. You were a child, she whispered. Yes, I said, my voice hardening. But I knew this. If I couldn't defeat him as a child, I would become a woman he never saw coming. Her eyes widened. I didn't want his apology. I didn't want his ruin to come from a courtroom where he'd cry and beg for mercy. I wanted him to see me rise. I wanted him to need me someday. And when that day came, I would give him nothing. Emma blinked back tears. Did that day ever come? Oh yes, I said, a slow smile forming. It came. It came when he was old. Alone. Dying. And I was the only person he trusted. Her eyebrows shot up. I was named executor of his will, I said, savoring the words. He made me his legal guardian after his first stroke. Said I was the only one with a good head on her shoulders. He thought I still adored him. Emma stared in disbelief. What did you do to him? She asked again. I let the silence stretch before replying. I showed him what it feels like to be powerless. I became the locked door, the silence, the cold eyes that wouldn't meet his. And I made sure every single asset he'd built, every donation, every name carved into a building was tied to his victims by the time he died. Emma gasped. You used his legacy against him? I nodded. I didn't scream. I didn't hit him. I erased him. She sat back, stunned. I picked up my teacup again, though it had long gone cold. And that, I said, was only the beginning. The hardest part wasn't the pain. It wasn't the bleeding. It wasn't the shame. It wasn't even the silence that came afterward, the long, unbearable quiet that stretched between days like thread pulled too tight. No, the hardest part was pretending I was fine. Pretending to laugh when the other girls at school shared stories about sleepovers and birthday parties. Pretending I didn't flinch when an adult placed a hand on my shoulder. Pretending to be a child when I already felt like a grave in a girl's body. That mask, painted with perfection and poise, became my armor. I learned to smile with my teeth just enough. To nod at the right moments. To speak clearly, but never too much. It was a delicate dance, performed under the scrutiny of teachers, neighbors, and family members who should have seen the truth, but chose not to. That was the real betrayal. Not just what he did to me, but what they didn't do. What they refused to do. At 14, I was invited to a private academy, one of those prestigious schools for gifted young ladies. My grandfather pulled strings, made generous donations, and praised me at the admission interviews. A bright little thing, he'd said. She's going to make us proud. And I smiled right beside him. Because I had to. Because even though he disgusted me, made my skin crawl and my stomach twist, I needed to stay close. I needed him to keep trusting me. I couldn't destroy a monster I couldn't reach. That school changed everything. Not because it was safe, no place ever truly was, but because it was distant. Hours away from the estate. I only returned for holidays, and by then, I'd learned how to keep the visits short and the smiles long. I remember one Christmas when I was 15. He gave me a necklace. Pearls. Said it belonged to my mother. I want you to have it, he whispered in my ear. Because you remind me of her. The way you carry yourself. The way you look at me. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just smiled and said, "Thank you, grandfather." That night, I buried the necklace beneath a rose bush in the garden. With the ribbon. With all the pieces of myself I never wanted to touch again. Emma watched me carefully now, like she wasn't sure whether to cry or applaud. I don't know how you survived that, she said. I didn't, I replied. Not the girl I was. She died a long time ago. The Eleanor they remember? The judge, the philanthropist, the face on those glossy magazine covers? That was someone I built. Brick by brick. Smile by smile. Because if I was going to be nothing more than his puppet, then I would be a puppet with power. Emma wiped her cheek. I started reading law journals when I was 16, I continued. Not because I wanted justice for everyone. That came later. In the beginning, it was personal. I wanted to understand the systems that protected men like him. I wanted to learn how to twist them, bend them, break them. Her eyes widened. You planned it that early? I planned it the moment I realized no one else would save me. At 17, I graduated top of my class. At 18, I entered university, pre-law track, scholarships paid for by his name. Every check he wrote, every public accolade he received for supporting women's education, all of it went into shaping the hand that would one day strike him down. And still, he never suspected. That was the power of the mask. Of pretending. Of walking through hell with perfect posture and a polished smile. I became his pride. His favorite. His so-called legacy. He had no idea I was building a noose behind his back, one made of signatures, contracts, surveillance records, and testimonies from those he'd forgotten. Other girls. Other victims. Ones who never had a voice, but who gave me theirs in whispers, in letters, in the quiet spaces where truth still lived. Emma finally spoke again. Did you ever feel Guilty? About pretending. No, I said. Because when someone takes everything from you, you get to decide what you become. I became the mirror he never dared look into. She nodded slowly, absorbing it all. And then, carefully, she asked, "So when did everything begin to change? When did you finally start pulling the strings?" I leaned back and let the firelight dance across my face. "When he got sick," I said. "That's when the monster lost his fangs. When the world saw an old man and I saw an opportunity." Emma stared. "And you took control?" I nodded. He was 72. I was 35. And for the first time in our lives, he needed me. I reached for the teacup once more. Still cold. Still enough. And I made sure he would regret it. I didn't poison him. People always imagine something dramatic. Arsenic in his tea, a shove down the stairs, a whispered confession followed by a gunshot. But vengeance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's slow, subtle, surgical. The first sting came wrapped in kindness. He was 72 when the first stroke hit him, collapsed in the study where he used to lock the doors behind me. There was something almost poetic about that. His body failing him in the same space where he once broke mine. I was already living in the city by then. A junior prosecutor, sharp as a blade and just as cold. I was halfway through cross-examining a corrupt CEO when I got the call, "Your grandfather's had an episode. He's asking for you." Not my father. Not my brother. Me. The golden girl. The legacy child. The one who never told. I took the next train out, not because I cared, but because I saw it. The first crack. The first tremor in the empire he'd spent decades building on silence and lies. He looked smaller when I saw him. Fragile. His face sagged slightly on one side, his words slurred. He grabbed my wrist with a shaking hand and whispered, "Don't let them put me in a home." And I smiled. "I won't," I told him. "I'll take care of everything." He didn't know I'd already been preparing. For years, I'd been quietly collecting the paperwork, durable power of attorney, medical proxies, estate planning. He signed everything without reading, trusted me. Why wouldn't he? I was the obedient granddaughter. His little prodigy. He didn't know the documents I'd brought that day weren't just medical releases, they were blueprints for his downfall. Within 6 months, I had full legal control over his care, his finances, and, most importantly, his estate. That was when I made my first move. I began selling off assets. Not everything, just pieces, small enough to go unnoticed by the family. I'd liquidate old investments, channel the money into anonymous donations, and reroute the rest through ironclad trusts bearing names like the Evelyn Initiative, Project Shelter, the Rose Foundation. All fronts. All real. All built for girls like me. Girls who had bled in silence. Emma sat rigid across from me, her pen paused above the page. "You gave his money to victims?" she asked. I looked her in the eye. "To survivors." She nodded, slowly, like the word had weight. "But how did no one catch on?" she asked. "They were never watching me," I said simply. "They were watching him." That's the thing about powerful men. They cast long shadows. And if you stay close enough, you can move unnoticed within them. My cousins were busy building careers off his name. My uncles were waiting for their inheritance. My grandmother, by then, frail and willfully blind, spoke of him like he was a war hero. No one questioned me. Not the banker. Not the lawyer. Not the priest who delivered communion to his bedside and praised his generosity. They didn't see the woman pulling the strings behind the curtain. They saw a devoted granddaughter tending to a dying man. But beneath that devotion, I was slicing through everything he built. Quietly, legally, permanently. "You were brilliant," Emma whispered. I tilted my head. "I was methodical," I corrected. "This wasn't about rage. Rage fades. This was about justice. A justice that had no room for emotion." She sat back in her chair, eyes flickering with a new kind of respect and maybe a little fear. "I didn't just want to erase his wealth," I added. "I wanted to rewrite it, redirect it. I wanted every dollar he earned from exploiting others to build the very shelters he never wanted to exist. She nodded slowly. You turned his empire into a weapon. Yes, I said. And it was only the beginning. Because as he weakened, so did his secrets. Emma sat rigid across from me, her pen paused above the page. You gave his money to victims? She asked. I looked her in the eye. To survivors. She nodded, slowly, like the word had weight. But how did no one catch on? She asked. They were never watching me, I said simply. They were watching him. That's the thing about powerful men. They cast long shadows. And if you stay close enough, you can move unnoticed within them. My cousins were busy building careers off his name. My uncles were waiting for their inheritance. My grandmother, by then, frail and willfully blind, spoke of him like he was a war hero. No one questioned me. Not the banker. Not the lawyer. Not the priest who delivered communion to his bedside and praised his generosity. They didn't see the woman pulling the strings behind the curtain. They saw a devoted granddaughter tending to a dying man. But beneath that devotion, I was slicing through everything he built. Quietly, legally, permanently. You were brilliant, Emma whispered. I tilted my head. I was methodical, I corrected. This wasn't about rage. Rage fades. This was about justice. A justice that had no room for emotion. She sat back in her chair, eyes flickering with a new kind of respect and maybe a little fear. I didn't just want to erase his wealth, I added. I wanted to rewrite it, redirect it. I wanted every dollar he earned from exploiting others to build the very shelters he never wanted to exist. She nodded slowly. You turned his empire into a weapon. Yes, I said. And it was only the beginning. Because as he weakened, so did his secrets. Nurses came and went. Some young, some hesitant. I listened carefully, paid attention. A few of them looked uncomfortable. One even quit after a week. I knew that look. I'd seen it in the mirror. So I started to investigate not him, but his past. His charities. His so-called mentorship programs. His business trips. The boarding school he funded in the 60s. And what I found was worse than I imagined. He hadn't stopped with me. He had used his power for decades to silence dozens of girls, many now women scattered across the country. Some had died. Some were still too afraid to speak. But a few were willing to talk. They remembered him. They remembered me. One of them, a woman named Judith, had been a housemaid's daughter. She was 12. Said he told her he was teaching her how to be a lady. She never told her mother. I didn't blame her. I took her testimony. And others. I paid their travel expenses, gave them legal counsel, and documented everything. Dates, names, patterns. I filed it all into a thick, sealed envelope marked "Do not open until final instruction." Emma's eyes were wide. Where is that envelope now? She asked. In my safe, I said. It will be opened after I die. Unless I decide to open it first. She stared at me, visibly shaken. But you could have brought it all out then, she whispered. You could have destroyed him publicly. I met her gaze. That would have made me the story, I said. And I didn't want to be a headline. I wanted to be the reckoning. I took a breath. Not because I needed one, but because it marked the end of this chapter. And when he finally died, I added, he went to his grave not knowing what I'd done. He thought he still had a legacy. Emma's voice trembled. And did he? I smiled. No, I said. He had a tombstone. That's all. His funeral was everything he would have wanted. Polished, extravagant, steeped in illusions. Black cars lined the drive. Floral arrangements choked the chapel in white lilies and red roses. Old men in tailored suits spoke of him as a pillar of the community. They told stories of golf tournaments and charity auctions and church galas, never once daring to look too closely at the shadow he left behind. But I watched them all. My cousins clung to their pearl necklaces and monogrammed handkerchiefs. My uncles made quiet jokes at the back pew, already circling the will like vultures. Even the mayor came, offering a speech I barely heard, something about legacy, integrity, influence. No one mentioned the girls. The ones he hurt. The ones who never made it to funerals of their own. They wouldn't have been welcome here. I sat in the front row, composed, veiled in black lace. They called me his pride, his rock, his beloved granddaughter. I nodded, thanked them, accepted condolences with hands that had already erased his legacy behind the scenes. And when the priest said, "May his soul rest in peace," I kept my eyes open. Because I didn't wish him peace. I wished him memory. After the burial, there was a reception at the estate, his estate now mine in all but name. Champagne, finger sandwiches, soft music. People whispered about the inheritance, about what I would do with it all. I smiled politely and said I hadn't decided yet. But I had. I decided long ago. At dusk, I asked everyone to gather in the grand hall for one final tribute. They assumed it would be a eulogy, a slideshow, some sentimental gesture from the grieving granddaughter. What they got was the beginning of the end. I stood before them, dozens of them, family, friends, lawyers, even clergy, and I spoke clearly, my voice slicing through the hush like glass. Thank you all for coming. Before you leave tonight, I'd like to read something. A letter. The last thing my grandfather ever gave me. The room shifted, curious. I pulled a crisp envelope from my coat and unfolded the contents slowly. But the letter wasn't from him. It was from me. A confession. A chronicle. A revelation. I am Eleanor Thorne, I began, and for decades I have lived under the shadow of a man you all admired. But the man you knew was not the one I knew. The man you praised built his wealth on silence and suffering, and I am no longer willing to protect that silence. There were gasps. Some shuffled in their seats. One of my uncles actually stood up and said, "This isn't the time, Eleanor." I raised a hand, silencing him. I was 11 when he first touched me, I continued. 13 when I bled on the leather of his study chair. 16 when I realized no one would believe me. And 35 when I finally took control. I let the words sink in like nails into polished floors. I've spent the last 4 decades dismantling everything he built. Quietly. Legally. Intentionally. The estate you stand in has been emptied. The accounts have been closed. Every asset, every dollar, every false monument to his name, redirected. To shelters. To victims. To girls like me. A woman sobbed in the back. I looked around, scanning each face. If you're angry, good. Be angry. Be uncomfortable. Because for too long, you all lived in comfort while I lived in shadow. I held up a second envelope. This, I said, is a sworn affidavit. Signed by 3 of his former house staff. Names you'll recognize. They saw things. They heard things. And they were paid to keep quiet. Gasps turned to murmurs. The inheritance you expected? I added. Gone. It went to the Eleanor Thorne Foundation for the Protection of Abused Women. Incorporated last year. Funded entirely by the empire he built and I dismantled. Emma sat across from me now, her eyes wide with awe and horror. You said all that? Out loud, she asked. I did, I said. And I watched them crumble. My cousins screamed. My uncles threatened lawsuits. My grandmother fainted, though frankly, I think she just didn't want to listen. It didn't matter. Because the documents were ironclad. The funds had already moved. The buildings had already been renamed. There was nothing left to take back. I didn't want revenge, I told her. I wanted reckoning. Emma was still reeling. But your reputation? You risked everything. No, I said. I risked his name. And he was already dead. I leaned in, voice quieter now. Let them call me bitter. Let them whisper behind my back. Let them curse the girl who turned a eulogy into a reckoning. I'll carry those curses with pride. Because for the first time in 70 years, I was no longer afraid. She swallowed hard, tears threatening her lashes. And now? She asked. What now? I looked out the window, where the roses bloomed a red, wild, and full of thorns. Now, I said, we tell the story. The estate didn't go quietly. No, it screamed. It bucked and flailed as I stripped it bare, as if the house itself could feel the weight of the history I was tearing down. The marble floors that once reflected his polished shoes, the oil portraits lining the hallways, the scent of cedar and power, it all became kindling. In the months after the funeral, the family clawed at me like starved wolves. Lawsuits, letters, threats. My youngest cousin called me a vengeful witch. One of the nephews who'd never lifted a finger a day in his life demanded an explanation for why the Thorne Trust had been emptied. I gave them nothing. Let them squirm. Let them feel helpless for once. I thought we were entitled to something. One of my uncles snarled over the phone. You were, I told him. The truth. You just didn't want it. I sold the estate. Quietly. Discreetly. The antiques were auctioned off anonymously. The art, some of it acquired under suspicious circumstances, was returned to the institutions he stole it from. The mansion itself, that monument to his ego, was bought by a non-profit that converted it into a safe house for at-risk girls. Imagine that. The very room where I bled would now be a refuge. I stood in it one last time before handing over the keys. The walls had been repainted. The floor sanded smooth. New curtains fluttered in the open windows. Sunlight poured in, soft and forgiving. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the only thing I had left of that night, the red ribbon. The same one he gave me to make me feel special. I had carried it with me all these years, not as a keepsake, but as a wound. I left it folded neatly on the windowsill. Let the house remember. Let it never forget. Emma's hand trembled as she jotted notes in her pad. How did it feel to watch it all go? I considered the question. Like a fever breaking, I said. Like waking up after a long, dark sleep. I'd lived so many years convincing myself I was healed, that I was past it. But it wasn't until I started dismantling what he built that I realized how much of him was still inside me, how much of me was still trapped in that house. She nodded slowly, tears in her eyes again. Not just for me, but for the girl I had been. And for the ones I did all this for. Some called it erasure, I said. Some said I was destroying my own bloodline, that I was tarnishing the family name. I leaned forward. But names are just words. And blood means nothing when it's poisoned. Emma's recorder blinked quietly on the table between us. Her voice was hoarse when she asked, "And the others? The women you helped? Do they know what you did?" "They do now," I said. Many of them received letters from me. Anonymous at first. Then personal. I offered them support, legal aid, employment, safe housing. One of them is running the foundation now. Judith, the girl he hurt before me. Emma's eyes widened. She made it, she whispered. She survived, I corrected. And she thrived, because someone finally saw her. There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth. I don't want the story to be about horror, I said at last. Or revenge. I want it to be about what happens after. After the screaming. After the silence. After the pretending. Emma nodded slowly. It's about survival. No, I said. It's about reclamation. About taking back what was stolen. Not just from me, but from all of us. She looked at me with something deeper than admiration. It was awe. You know, she said softly, this story is going to change lives. I shook my head. It already did, I said. Mine. I reached for the final file in my desk drawer, the one that contained all the signed releases, the statements, the transfer orders. Proof of everything I'd done, clean and legal and irrevocable. This, I said, handing it to her, is yours. Use it wisely, because when the world reads what I did, they will come for you too. Not with fists, but with doubts, with denials, with excuses. They'll call you dramatic, delusional, dangerous. She looked up, strong now. Let them. I smiled. You're ready. And with that, I watched the last ember of his legacy turn to ash in the fireplace behind me. There's a silence that comes after the storm. Not peace, no. Not yet. But a silence that hums beneath the surface, heavy and waiting. The kind of silence that settles in your bones after you've done something irreversible. That's what I felt the night the article went live. Emma had asked for 1 week. 7 days to fact-check, re-interview, verify every detail. She didn't want anyone poking holes in the story, not when the truth had been buried for so long. She worked like a woman possessed, and I let her. Because I knew what was coming. Because I had waited a lifetime to hear the truth spoken by someone other than me. The piece dropped at midnight. By sunrise, it was everywhere. Eleanor Thorne breaks silence on generational abuse, dismantles family empire to fund victim support. Some headlines called me brave. Others called me unhinged. A few called me a liar. None of that mattered. Because now, the world knew. My voice, our voices, had pierced the veneer of legacy and respectability. No more statues. No more streets named after him. No more awards, no more scholarships bearing his cursed name. They started tearing it all down by the afternoon. The portrait of him that once hung in the law school library, removed. Quietly. The building once called the Thorne Center for Excellence, stripped of its title. Donations returned. Events canceled. A dozen other families came forward, some with gratitude, others with rage. My phone rang for days. Most of the calls I didn't answer. But when I did, it came from a blocked number. I recognized the voice before she even said her name. Eleanor, my grandmother said, her voice weak and shaking. Why would you do this? I closed my eyes. You knew, I said quietly. You always knew. I was trying to protect the family, she whispered. No, I replied. You were trying to protect him. And you failed. She sobbed. She told me she didn't understand. That I had ruined the Thorne name. And I told her something I had been waiting 50 years to say. You don't get to mourn the ashes when you helped light the fire. I hung up. And that was the last time I spoke to her. Emma came by that evening, eyes wide from the chaos. She told me a producer wanted to adapt the story. A book deal. A documentary. Survivors from all over the country were reaching out. Donations to the foundation were pouring in millions in 24 hours. And yet, I sat in the same chair as always, drinking lukewarm tea like it was just another Wednesday. You changed the world, she said, standing there, breathless. I looked at her. No, I said. I revealed it. She nodded, slowly. She understood now. It doesn't feel like victory, she admitted. It never does, I replied. Because victory isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the absence of fear. The absence of guilt. I reached for the folder she'd left behind, the one with copies of every document, every signed statement, every recorded memory. I ran my fingers over it like a relic, a tomb of everything I had buried. And then I stood. We walked outside together, into the garden. The air was crisp. The roses were blooming again, wild and red. I walked to the stone path, the one that led to the old shed. The one place on the property that had never been touched by renovation. Inside, I opened the iron stove. Its belly was empty. Waiting. I placed the folder inside. One by one. The ribbon, the stained handkerchief, the photograph of me as a child, smiling through the lie. I lit the match. Emma stood behind me, silent. And then we watched it burn. Not with fanfare. Not with vengeance. But with purpose. The past turned to ash before our eyes. Not erased, but released. I thought you might keep it, she said softly. I don't need it anymore, I replied. The world can carry the memory now. I've carried it long enough. She nodded, eyes wet. The flames dimmed. Smoke curled up into the night like a prayer. Ashes to ashes, I whispered. But not dust to dust. Not this time. Because this time, something grew in its place. Hope. There was one room left. One door I hadn't opened in over 50 years. It sat at the end of the west corridor, behind layers of repainted walls and replaced doorknobs. To the world, it was just a storage space, sealed long ago and forgotten in renovation plans. No one questioned why I kept it locked. Not the staff, not the contractors, not even Emma, until that morning. She arrived at the house carrying coffee and a stack of messages from news outlets, survivors, and lawyers. I barely glanced at them. The noise was growing louder outside. Yes, but in here it was growing still. And that was how I knew the time had come. There's something I want you to see, I told her. Emma followed me through the halls, down the corridor no one else used. Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood. The air was different back there, colder somehow, still marked by a time that hadn't yet let go. I stopped at the old wooden door. It looked unassuming, unimportant, but my heart pounded as I pulled the key from around my neck and slid it into the lock. The door creaked open, slow and reluctant, as though even the wood resisted remembering. Inside, dust swirled like spirits. The room was small, barely more than a box. No windows. Just cracked plaster walls, a warped bookshelf, and a heavy metal file cabinet bolted to the floor. The same cabinet he used to lock behind him when I was a child. I had kept everything. Documents, photographs, correspondence, his letters, his ledgers, records of every bribe, every payout, every whisper he buried beneath marble and charm. I had copied them over the years, slowly and carefully. Some originals, some duplicates, but all real. Emma stood frozen at the threshold. "Why here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because this is where it began," I said. "And because some truths deserve a room of their own." She stepped inside, her eyes moving across the room like a child tiptoeing through a graveyard. Her gaze landed on the small desk in the corner, familiar, worn, stained with ink. "That's where he kept his journal," I said. "The one no one knew about. The one he wrote in after the nights he hurt me." Emma's face went pale. "You read them?" "Yes." "Every word." I walked over and placed a hand on the desk. He never wrote names. Just dates. Emotions. Triumphs. Regrets. He wrote as if he were documenting greatness, not depravity. Emma knelt near the file cabinet, brushing dust from a label. Confidential, 1972 to 1985. "These are all." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Victims," I said for her. "The ones I could find. The ones who spoke. The ones who died before they could." She stood up slowly, swallowing hard. "Why didn't you destroy this too? Like the other files?" "Because fire purges, but memory preserves." I turned toward her, voice firm. "One day, people will question what happened. They'll call it exaggerated. They'll rewrite it into something softer. And when that happens, this room will stand as witness." Emma nodded, her voice cracking. "You thought of everything." "No," I said. "I just remembered everything." The silence in the room was heavy now. Not painful, but sacred. Emma reached into her coat and handed me a small box. Inside was a brass plaque. I had forgotten I'd ordered it. Together, we mounted it to the inside of the door. Room of remembrance for every girl who was silenced, erased, or dismissed. You were not forgotten. Not by me. I stepped back, and for the first time in decades, I let my shoulders fall. The burden lifted, not gone, but shared now. A legacy no longer hidden in whispers and shame, but etched in truth. Emma turned to me, eyes shimmering. "This story, it's going to change how people see you." I smiled gently. "I don't want them to see me," I said. "I want them to see her." She looked puzzled. "The girl I used to be," I clarified. "The one who bled on the floor of his study and still found a way to stand up. The one who made a decision." Emma nodded slowly. "And what do we do now?" she asked. I looked at the room one last time, then closed the door. This time, not to hide it, but to honor it. "Now," I said, "we build something better." I never thought I'd live long enough to feel peace. Not the artificial kind, the one bought with denial and silence. Not the peace of distraction or numbness. I mean real peace, the kind that grows slowly like moss over stone. Quiet, patient, steady. The kind that comes when you've done everything you can and there's nothing left to hide. It's strange, in a way. For most of my life, I was never sure who I truly was. I was the girl who learned to stop crying before she learned to multiply. I was the granddaughter who smiled through pain so convincingly, they mistook it for pride. I was the woman who studied law not to protect the system, but to weaponize it. I was the judge who never wavered, the donor who signed checks without blinking. And for decades, I was the secret keeper, the one who carried it all. But today, I am just Eleanor. Not Thorne, not Your Honor, not the heiress or the destroyer of legacies. Just a woman. Old now, weathered, but whole, finally. Emma stayed with me through the morning. We sat on the back veranda where the sun hit the garden just right, making the roses glow like stained glass. The same roses I'd once buried that blood-soaked ribbon beneath, now they grew wild and unbothered, unburdened. "Do you regret anything?" she asked softly, cradling a cup of tea she barely touched. I didn't answer right away. Regret is a complicated thing. It sneaks in through the cracks when you're not looking. It pretends to be humility, but more often, it's just the voice of people who were never asked to survive what you did. "I regret that no one stopped him before I did," I said at last. "I regret that I wasn't strong enough to protect the others sooner. But I do not regret the decision I made." Emma nodded, understanding the difference. She was scheduled to appear on a major news network that evening. They wanted her to talk about the article, what it was like to sit in this house, hear these stories, witness the unraveling of a dynasty. "You should be the one to speak," she said to me. "No," I replied. "They need to hear it from someone younger. Someone who can carry the truth further than I ever could." "You're not just reporting the story now, Emma. You're part of it." She blinked at me. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of weight." I smiled, slow and knowing. "No one ever is. But you carry it anyway. Because you must." She left that afternoon. I watched her drive down the gravel path, past the iron gates that once symbolized power. Now, they stood open. I stayed on the veranda, watching the sky turn gold with dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang soft and clean, like the closing of a long-forgotten chapter. I thought of the girls, of Judith, of the housemaid's daughter, of the nurses who quit too soon, of the little Eleanor, the one with blood on her socks and fire in her eyes. I saw her in the rose garden. Just a flicker of memory. But she was smiling. Not the tight, fearful smile she wore for him. A real smile. One that said, "You did it." And I whispered back, "Yes, I did. I made a decision the day he broke me. Not to end it. Not to bury it. But to carry it." And now, at the end of this long, hard road, I lay it down. This is my story. This is my reckoning. This is my freedom. I didn't sleep the night the article went live. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew everything had changed. The story wasn't just published. It was detonated. By morning, it was the headline across every platform. Judge Eleanor Thorne dismantles her own family to expose generational abuse. The image accompanying it wasn't a courtroom portrait. It was a simple photo I'd taken without her noticing, her silhouette standing in the rose garden, her cane in one hand, her spine straight as a sword. The world hadn't known what to do with that kind of woman. Some praised her, called her a feminist icon, a survivor, a warrior. Others hated her, said she was a liar, a bitter old woman ruining a dead man's reputation for attention. They questioned her motives, her memory, her sanity. But no one was indifferent. In the first 72 hours, I received over 4,000 emails. Hundreds from survivors. Dozens from people who had met Eleanor and never suspected a thing. One message simply read, "She gave me the strength to tell my daughter." I was no longer just a journalist. I was the vessel carrying Eleanor's voice. And it terrified me. I stared at my reflection in the studio's green room mirror, palms sweating, hair sprayed into place by some intern named Colby. My segment was next. National television. Prime time. A 5-minute interview to explain how I uncovered one of the most explosive stories in modern legal history. Only I didn't uncover it. She gave it to me. And now I had to carry it. The host was chipper and practiced. She smiled like someone who'd never cried in public, then leaned in with her camera-ready gaze. So, Emma, what was it like being face to face with a woman who hid such a powerful secret for so long? I could feel Eleanor's voice in my memory. Steady, slow, measured like a gavel striking oak. I chose my words carefully. It was like sitting across from history, not the kind in textbooks. The kind that bleeds. The kind that survives. The host blinked. I think she expected something fluffier. She's a complicated figure, she said, her smile tightening. A lot of people are saying she should have spoken sooner. That by staying silent for so long, she allowed harm to continue. How do you respond to that? My jaw clenched. I'd say they're asking the wrong question. She raised a perfectly arched brow. Which is? I stared straight into the camera. Not why she stayed silent, but why no one listened. The segment ended with applause, but in my chest, it felt like a funeral bell. Afterward, a man approached me in the hallway. Late 50s, expensive watch, pale hands that trembled when he reached out. My daughter read your article, he said. Then she told me about her uncle. I didn't know what to say. He said thank you, then walked away. That night, I returned to Eleanor's house. Not for an interview, just to sit with her. She was in the study, sipping tea, watching the news without the sound. When she saw me, she smiled, not the proud kind, but the knowing kind. You carried it well, she said. You didn't flinch. I wanted to. You didn't. I sat across from her, still dressed in makeup and wires, still buzzing from the weight of being the messenger. I didn't expect it to be this heavy, I admitted. Eleanor leaned forward. Truth is heavy, she said. That's why so few people carry it to the end. We were quiet for a while. Then she looked out the window and said something I didn't expect. There's one more thing I haven't told you. There was something about the way she said it. One more thing I haven't told you that made the air feel colder. Eleanor wasn't the type to exaggerate. Everything she'd shared so far had been meticulous, deliberate, cataloged like a legal record with every piece backed by documentation. But this was different. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked past me, into the garden again. The roses had long since lost their bloom. Winter had stripped them bare. Yet her eyes were full of color, as if she could still see something the rest of us couldn't. Is it something you forgot? I asked gently. No, she said. It's something I buried. She stood slowly, painfully, but with purpose, and motioned for me to follow her. We didn't head to the archive room or the study. We went to the cellar. The door groaned when she opened it. The steps creaked under our weight. Cold air wrapped around us like a second skin. I'd never been down there before. No one had. She always said it was just for storage. But what I found was a room frozen in time. There were boxes stacked along the walls. Yellowed papers. Dusty furniture. But at the center of the room was a large chest. Cedarwood. Iron-bound. The kind of thing you'd find in the attic of a haunted house. Eleanor knelt beside it and pulled a small brass key from her sleeve. Her hands shook as she fitted into the lock. I haven't opened this since 1984, she said. The lid creaked open, revealing its contents, a collection of sealed envelopes, newspaper clippings, and at the very bottom, a single Polaroid. She handed it to me. It showed a girl I didn't recognize. Maybe 12, maybe younger. Her eyes were swollen. Her shirt was torn. She was sitting on the edge of what looked like the old estate garden wall. In the background, a man's shadow loomed just outside the frame. My stomach twisted. She was his first, Eleanor whispered. At least, the first I could confirm. Who is she? I asked, voice unsteady. Her name was Clara, my cousin. She disappeared in 1955. They said she ran away. But I always knew. Deep down, I knew. I looked down at the Polaroid again. Where did you get this? He gave it to me, she said. The day before my mother died. My throat went dry. He gave you a photograph of her like this? Eleanor nodded, her eyes glassy. He said if I ever told anyone what he did, this would happen to me. That they'd find me in a ditch like Clara. That no one would believe a child over a war hero. And I believed him. For a long, long time. The gravity of her silence pressed on me. Why didn't you include this in the public file? I asked. Because if I had, it wouldn't have been about justice anymore. It would have been about revenge. I couldn't prove what he did to her. I didn't have her body. Just this photo. Just his threat. She handed me the envelope marked Clara. Inside were old journal entries. Letters written by Eleanor at age 11, addressed to Mama, but never sent. They were full of confusion, fear, pleas for her mother to come back. And in between those pages, sketches of Clara's face. She was the ghost that followed me into every courtroom, Eleanor said. Every time I stood before a victim, I saw her. And every time I hesitated, I remembered I was still alive, and she wasn't. Tears spilled silently down my face. You kept this secret, even from yourself, I whispered. Yes, she said. But I can't anymore. She stood slowly and looked around the cellar like it might collapse under the weight of what it held. I want you to have it all, she said. Eleanor, this is a cold case. It's a story, she corrected. And it needs to be told. Because silence is what killed her. I tucked the photo and letters into my bag, my hands trembling. And as I followed her back up the stairs, I realized the story hadn't ended. It had just shifted focus. Clara was still waiting. And I was the one who had to find her. I couldn't sleep after that. The photograph of Clara haunted me. Not just because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't. Her face was bruised, her blouse torn, but her eyes were still there. Wide, alert, almost pleading. Like she knew someone would find her someday, and she wanted to be remembered. I laid the Polaroid on the desk beside me as I read through the rest of the contents in the envelope. The letters Eleanor had written as a child were devastating. Mama, I think something bad happened to Clara. Mama, Grandpa said she's fine, but her eyes were sad when she left. Mama, do you think ghosts follow you if they have something to say? The last letter was written in red ink, almost frantic. Mama, I heard Grandpa's voice outside the window last night. But Clara's voice came after. She said don't forget. She said make them remember. I clutched the paper like it could answer me back. How could a child carry something so heavy? The next morning, I visited the Public Records Archive downtown. I searched for any documentation on Clara Thorne. Birth certificate? Yes. School enrollment? Yes. One disciplinary note about inappropriate behavior during a church function. But that was it. No police report. No missing persons case. Just silence. Erased. Like she never existed. I knew better. I took my search to the state records office next. No marriage certificate. No driver's license. No obituary. Just a single juvenile delinquency file sealed by court order in 1956. Can I request access? I asked the clerk. She frowned. Only with a court order or family authorization. I hesitated. Then I pulled out a document Eleanor had given me weeks earlier, legal proxy. It named me as the official representative of her estate and legacy for the purpose of historical preservation and survivor advocacy. The woman at the counter read it twice, then disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she carried a thin manila folder. I opened it right there. Inside were only 2 sheets of paper and a grainy black and white photo of Clara in what looked like a juvenile girl's home. She looked thinner, paler, her eyes duller than in the Polaroid. The report was brief. Clara Thorne. Age, 13. Committed to St. Gertrude's Home for Wayward Girls. Reason, behavioral issues. Referred by legal guardian, Edwin Thorne. My chest went tight. He hadn't just silenced her. He institutionalized her. St. Gertrude's had been shut down in the late 80s for violations of care. That was putting it mildly. I'd written a short piece during journalism school about facilities like it, places that weren't really homes, but prisons for inconvenient girls. Girls who knew too much. Girls who didn't stay quiet. I spent the rest of the day digging. By sunset, I had a lead, a former resident who'd survived St. Gertrude's and now ran a support group for women who had been committed as teens. Her name was Yvonne Carlisle. She lived 2 hours north. I called, told her who I was, what I was looking for. She was silent for a long time before replying. "I remember Clara," she said. "She didn't last long. My heart seized. She died there." "No," Yvonne said. "She escaped." The silence on my end was deafening. "She climbed the north fence one night during a rainstorm," Yvonne continued. "They said she drowned in the river, but we never saw a body. Some girls swore they heard her voice in the woods after that. I always hoped she made it out." I whispered, "What did she say before she left?" Yvonne paused. Then, softly, she said, "Tell Eleanor I didn't run away. He sent me there." My hand flew to my mouth. My eyes stung. "I'll come see you tomorrow," I said. "I need to know everything." And as I hung up, I felt the weight of Eleanor's story shift in my hands. It wasn't just hers anymore. It never had been. The drive to Yvonne Carlisle's house felt like a pilgrimage. I took back roads through old mining towns and faded farmland, places where secrets felt stitched into the soil. My GPS lost signal 10 minutes before I arrived, as if even the satellites were hesitant to follow this path. Her home was modest, a small cottage tucked behind a line of skeletal trees, paint peeling, wind chimes rusted, but still singing. She opened the door before I knocked. "You're younger than I expected," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "You're stronger than I expected," I replied and meant it. Yvonne was in her late 70s, maybe early 80s, but her eyes were sharp. Her hair was coiled in a neat bun, her posture stiff with defiance rather than age. She wore a faded sweatshirt that read St. Gertrude's Doesn't Forget, a quiet rebellion against the institution that had tried to erase her. We sat at a table cluttered with papers, photographs, and what looked like old advocacy pamphlets. "I never thought anyone would come asking about Clara," she said. "Not after all these years. She's part of something bigger now," I told her. "Her story isn't buried anymore." Eleanor made sure of it. Yvonne's expression softened. "Eleanor, that girl had fire even when she was silent. I remember seeing her once. Her family visited the home. She wasn't allowed to come inside, of course. But she stood by the fence. She reached for a photograph, a grainy, black and white image of a teenage girl watching through chain links, eyes wide with something between hope and terror. "That's her," Yvonne whispered. She stood there for 15 minutes. Never said a word. Just watched. My throat tightened. She told me she always felt Clara was near, that she never really left her. She was right, Yvonne said. Clara lived in all of us. The stories she told before she ran about what your grandfather did changed everything. We didn't have words for it back then. Just fear. But once Clara spoke, we saw it. In each other. In ourselves. Do you think she survived? I asked. Yvonne looked at me for a long time. I don't know. But I do know this, girls like Clara don't vanish without a trace. They leave threads. You just have to know where to pull. She slid a paper across the table. A list of names. Girls committed to St. Gertrude's during the same year as Clara. A few had annotations beside them. Missing. Deceased. Escaped. One name had a red circle. M. Hollis. Alias? Clara used to talk about escaping and starting over, Yvonne explained. She always liked the name Margaret. Said it sounded safe. My pulse quickened. I think she changed her name. Lived off the grid. Maybe even got help from someone who believed her. Yvonne's fingers tapped the name. Find Margaret Hollis, she said. I think she was Clara. Or at least, what was left of her. I took the list, folded it carefully. Yvonne, I asked, why did you never tell anyone all this? Why wait until now? She looked out the window. Rain had started falling. Gentle, relentless. Because no one asked, she said. Until now. I left her house with the list in my jacket and a storm in my chest. Clara hadn't just been a ghost in Eleanor's story, she was the beginning of it. The spark that ignited everything. And if there was even a chance she had survived, I owed it to both of them to find her. The girl in the photograph wasn't done speaking. And I wasn't done listening. The name Margaret Hollis might as well have been a needle in a haystack. But the moment I typed it into a regional census archive, I felt something shift. There were dozens of Margarets, hundreds even. But only 3 Hollises living in the region around the time Clara would have resurfaced. One in her 20s, one deceased, and one listed on a property deed in a remote corner of New Hampshire, an isolated cabin, deeded in 1981 under the name Margaret C. Hollis, age unknown. The C stopped me cold. Clara. Could she really have lived all this time, hidden, quietly rebuilding her life as the world went on without her? I printed the address, circled it 3 times, and packed a bag. I didn't tell anyone, not even Eleanor. If I was wrong, I didn't want to reopen her wounds. But if I was right, she deserved the ending no one gave her. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road barely wide enough for 1 car. Birch trees clawed at the sky on either side, and a hush had fallen over everything, as if even the forest knew what I was here to find. The roof was moss-covered. The shutters closed. No mailbox. No neighbors for miles. But the chimney was smoking. Someone was home. I stepped onto the porch and knocked once, twice. My hand trembled. The silence was thick. Then, the door opened. She stood there in a thick wool sweater, her gray hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her eyes, green and watchful, narrowed when she saw me. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. "You're the girl from the article," she said. I froze. "You, read it." She gave a slight nod. "We don't have internet, but a neighbor brings newspapers. Said I might want to see it." I didn't know what to say. My mouth opened. Closed. Finally, "Are you Clara?" A long pause. She stepped back. "Come in." The cabin was clean. Sparse. No photos. No decorations. Just books. A fireplace. A kettle on the stove. She moved slowly, with care, but with strength. A survivor's gait. She poured tea and sat across from me like we were old friends. I noticed a scar beneath her left eye. Faded, but unmistakable. The same one I'd seen in that photograph. "I haven't heard that name in 60 years, she said. "But yes, I was Clara Thorne." My breath caught. "You're alive," I whispered. She nodded. "Barely. For a while. But yes. How did you escape?" She stirred her tea, then looked me in the eyes. "I climbed the fence in the middle of a storm. I ran until my legs gave out. Collapsed in someone's barn. A woman found me. A widow. Never had children. She let me stay. Taught me how to lie about my past. Gave me a name. When she died, I kept it." I blinked back tears. "And you never went back?" Clara shook her head. "I knew what would happen if I did. They would say I was unstable. Lying. Attention-seeking. Better to become someone else than fight a battle no one wanted to witness." I swallowed. "Eleanor thought you were dead." Her lips tightened. "I thought she would be." I told her everything about the archives, the foundation, the fire she lit in the courtroom, and the world. Clara listened without blinking, her tea growing cold in her hands. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, she remembered me. "After all this time, she never forgot you." Her eyes welled up. "One tear. Just one. I dreamed," she whispered, "that one day someone would say my name and not mean to bury it." I reached into my bag and pulled out the Polaroid. The one she'd never known Eleanor kept. I slid it across the table. She stared at it like it was a ghost. Then slowly, tenderly, she picked it up and held it to her chest. I was so afraid, she said, voice cracking. I thought no one would ever come looking. I looked at her not as a relic, but as a miracle. I'm here, I said. And I knew then. The story wasn't over. It had just been waiting for us to return to it. I didn't want to leave. Clara, Margaret, as she now called herself, walked me to the door with quiet steps and a look in her eyes that I couldn't name. Not fear, not hope. Something in between. Something worn thin by decades of silence, but never fully extinguished. You'll tell her, she asked, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. She'll want to see you. Clara looked away. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. She thought you were dead, I said gently. She carried you inside her all these years. I know. Her voice was steady, but something behind it trembled. But I don't know how to be remembered by someone who last saw me broken. I understood what she meant. Eleanor had built her strength on survival. Clara had built hers on disappearance. They had chosen opposite doors in the same burning house. But both were still standing. I'll go to her, Clara said quietly. But not yet. I need a little more time to stop being afraid. I respected that. Healing wasn't linear. Some ghosts needed to linger before they allowed themselves peace. We exchanged numbers, hers written in careful block letters on a folded piece of paper, mine saved on a tiny, dusty flip phone she barely knew how to use. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw her standing in the doorway, the Polaroid still pressed against her chest like a heartbeat she was finally allowed to feel again. Eleanor was in the garden when I returned. She traded her cane for a walking stick, wrapped in dark oak and carved with something that looked like wings. The roses were gone now, just bare stems and frozen earth. She didn't look surprised to see me. Just, ready? Well, she asked. Did you find her? I didn't speak. I just handed her the photo. Her hands shook when she took it. For a moment, I thought she might fall. But she didn't. She stood taller, staring at Clara's face like she was watching the child version of herself come back from the dead. She's alive, I said softly. Eleanor pressed the photo to her lips. And then she cried. Not the tears of grief, or rage, or exhaustion, but tears of relief, of release, of something long held and finally let go. I always hoped, she whispered. I told myself I was being foolish. But I hoped. She wants to see you, I said. But she needs time. Eleanor nodded. So do I. We sat on the garden bench together in silence for a long time. Then she said, Do you know what the worst part of survival is? I looked at her. It's the moment you realize you've outlived the version of yourself that never got the ending she deserved. I understood now. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. This was about restoration. About making sure the girls they had been, the frightened children who once whispered to locked doors, finally had their names spoken, their stories honored, their hands held across the decades. Eleanor turned to me, her voice steady again. I want to go public, she said. With Clara's name. With her story. If she'll allow it. She will, I said. Eventually. Eleanor looked up at the sky, clouded and gray but peaceful. Then we wait. And, for the first time, I saw something in her that hadn't been there before. Peace. Not just for herself, but for Clara. For the girl in the photograph. It was snowing the day she called me. The kind of snow that falls slow and silent, without urgency. It reminded me of the day my mother died, how the sky had turned white as porcelain and everything had gone quiet except for the sound of my own heartbeat. I had always hated snow for that reason. But that morning, it didn't feel cruel. It felt like a beginning. The phone rang just once before I answered it. I didn't say hello. I didn't have to. It's me, she said. The voice was older, roughened by time, shaped by silence. But there was no doubt. It was Clara. My Clara. I wasn't sure you'd pick up, she said after a moment. I've been waiting for 65 years, I said. Of course I picked up. There was a pause. And then, soft as wind through pine needles, she said, "Eleanor." I closed my eyes. She hadn't said my name in decades. Not since we were girls hiding under the attic rafters while the adults drank and laughed and forgot we existed. Back when we still thought shadows were only for bedtime stories. Hearing it now was like finding a photograph of yourself from a life you barely believed was real. "I read everything," Clara said. Emma showed me the article, the letters, even the court documents. "I should have come looking for you," I whispered. "I thought you were gone." "I was," she said. "But so were you." We didn't speak for a while after that. Sometimes silence is the only way to carry something so sacred it can't yet be spoken. But I could hear her breathing, alive, real, and that was enough. "I want to see you," I said. "When you're ready." "I'm ready now," she replied. And just like that, the snow outside stopped falling. Emma came with me. She didn't need to. I didn't ask her to. But when I looked at her that morning, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, gently stirring her tea with the steadiness of someone far older than her years, I realized she belonged in this moment. She was the thread that bound us back together. The drive was quiet. No music. No talking. Just the rhythm of tires rolling over frostbitten roads. Clara's cabin looked like something from another life. Smaller than I expected, but strong, solid, still standing. Just like her. She opened the door before I reached the porch. And for the first time since we were children, we looked at each other without fear between us. Her hair was silver now. Her hands marked with age. But her eyes, they were the same. We didn't say anything. We just held each other. There were no sobs. No outbursts. Just two old women clinging to the one piece of their childhood that survived the fire. Emma stood a few steps back, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. "I thought you'd forgotten me," Clara whispered in my ear. "I remembered you every day," I said. "I just didn't know if you wanted to be found." "I did," she said. "I just didn't know if I could still be loved." I pulled back and looked at her. "You were never unloved," I said. "Only unseen." We went inside, sat by the fire, talked for hours. We spoke of the past, not just the pain, but the joy we were never allowed to keep. We told each other things we had once buried so deep we forgot they were ours. And when the sun dipped below the trees, we lit candles and read the names of every girl we'd lost to silence. Names no one else remembered. But we did, because we were the witnesses. We were the memory. And finally, we were free. There's something sacred about speaking the names of the forgotten. Clara and I sat by the fire, a stack of old papers between us. Most of the names were handwritten, some in ink, some in pencil, some smudged with tears that had dried decades ago. Emma sat nearby, typing softly into her laptop, recording the names with reverence. We didn't just say them, we remembered them. Each one, a girl we'd lost to fear, to silence, to the brutal systems that chewed them up and called it protection. Girls who were blamed, discarded, locked away, or simply erased. Some names were full, others only initials. But each one mattered. "Judith Lamont," Clara said, her voice catching. "She came forward after I started investigating," I whispered. Her testimony helped me dismantle his foundation. "She used to braid my hair at St. Gertrude's," Clara murmured, smiling faintly. "She hummed lullabies when the night got too loud." She pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "I thought she was dead." "She's not," I said. "She's running the foundation now." Clara smiled, soft and slow. "Good." She was always stronger than she believed. We continued down the list. "Darlene Knox," I said. "Rosalind S." Clara added. "Marie Temple." "Esther Carr." We said them all. Dozens. Maybe 100. Some had been found. Others never would be. But their names echoed in that room like prayers. Like thunder. Like the voice we had been denied for too long. When we reached the last name, Clara folded the paper in half and held it to the flame. The edges caught quickly. The fire consumed it in seconds, but we didn't look away. They were more than victims, she said. They were girls. With laughter. With dreams. And they were stolen. And now they are remembered, I said. The ash curled up the chimney and disappeared into the sky. Names on the wind. That night, Clara and I shared a small meal, something simple, something warm. Afterward, she showed me a photo tucked behind the mirror above her sink. It was worn with time, its edges frayed. It showed the two of us, maybe aged 10 and 12, sitting side by side beneath the treehouse in the backyard of the Thorne estate. We were smiling. Real smiles. I kept it, she said. Even when I tried to forget everything else. I kept this. My throat tightened. It was the last good summer, I whispered. Before everything changed. She nodded. I think part of me held onto it so I'd remember who I was before he touched us. I reached out, touched her hand. You never stopped being her. She turned to me, eyes glassy but steady. Neither did you. We were quiet for a long while after that. The kind of silence that feels holy. When I finally returned to the guest room Emma had taken over earlier, I found her asleep at the desk, her laptop still glowing with open files. I closed the lid gently and draped a blanket over her shoulders. She'd carried so much, just like we had. But in that moment, with the fire dying down and the ashes of old names still warm in the hearth, I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe until now. The story wasn't just mine anymore. It was Clara's. It was Emma's. It was all of ours. And it was still being written. Clara spoke publicly for the first time on a Thursday. It wasn't planned. Not formally. There was no stage, no podium, no press release. Just a modest room in a community center, 36 folding chairs, and a handwritten sign taped to the wall, Voices That Survived. The event had started small, just a quiet gathering of survivors and advocates hosted by the Eleanor Thorne Foundation. But word spread. By the time I arrived, the room was full. Reporters sat in the back rows, pretending not to take notes. I spotted 3 different documentary crews. No lights, no microphones. Just people. And then Clara walked in. The air shifted like the moment before a storm. She wore a charcoal gray coat, her braid tied with a ribbon that looked suspiciously like Eleanor's, red satin, frayed at the ends. She walked to the front without hesitation, her cane barely tapping the floor. The room went silent. And then, for the first time in 60 years, Clara Thorne opened her mouth. My name, she said slowly, is Margaret Hollis. She let that settle. For most of my life, I have lived under a name I chose to survive. I built a life from scraps of silence, of shame, of stories I was too afraid to tell. She looked toward me, then toward Eleanor, who sat in the front row, her hand resting gently on her walking stick like a scepter. I thought I'd buried the girl I used to be, but she kept waking me up at night, asking why I let them forget her. A murmur of quiet agreement rippled through the room. So, Clara said, straightening, let me be clear. I was that girl. I am that girl. My name was Clara Thorne. I was 13 when my grandfather sent me to a home for the unmanageable. I wasn't unmanageable. I was inconvenient. Gasps. Some nods. Some tears. She didn't falter. I escaped. I disappeared. And I survived. But survival doesn't mean silence. Not anymore. Not today. She pulled out a slip of paper and read 10 names. Girls who never got out. Girls she'd watched suffer behind locked doors. When she said their names, it was with the same care you'd use to fold a flag. Then she folded the paper, tucked it into her coat, and looked directly into the cameras at the back of the room. To every girl who still believes her story is too ugly to be told, know this: you are not a burden. You are a witness. And the world needs witnesses more than ever. The room rose to its feet. Not because they were told to, but because they had to. Eleanor didn't clap. She simply stood, her eyes glassy, her chin lifted high. And when Clara stepped down from the front, She didn't return to her seat. She walked straight into Eleanor's arms. That night, the footage went viral. Clara Thorne was trending worldwide within hours. Articles poured in. News anchors called her brave. Politicians posted tributes. But the real ripple was in the inboxes, thousands of messages flooding the foundation's servers. She said the words I never could. I thought I was the only one. Now I believe I might survive too. I watched Clara and Eleanor read some of the letters together, side by side on the couch. They didn't say much, just smiled softly, nodded when something resonated, cried a little. The revolution wasn't loud. It was steady, like breath, like healing, like truth finally given permission to stand in the light. I always thought I'd die alone, not in a dramatic way, not slumped over in some echoing mansion, forgotten by the world I'd once defied. No, I simply assumed that the weight I carried was mine alone to bear, that by the time the truth was spoken, I'd be gone. But fate is a curious thing. It let me live just long enough to see something I never thought I'd witness. Justice. Not perfect justice. Not the kind delivered by courts or headlines, but the kind that lives in names spoken aloud, in eyes that no longer look away. That evening, I stood on the edge of the garden where the roses would soon bloom again. Clara stood beside me, her hand lightly resting on my arm. Emma stood just behind us, camera in hand, not to film, not to exploit, but to preserve. This wasn't for the world. This was for us. I made a decision, I said softly, the day my mother died. And again, the day he touched me. And again, every time I stayed silent when I wanted to scream. Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. But the most important decision I ever made, I continued, was to live long enough to undo what he did. Not to erase it. Not to pretend it never happened. But to rewrite the ending. Emma lowered the camera, tears catching the last light of sunset. I'm tired, I admitted. But I'm not finished. Clara turned to me. What's left to do? I smiled. Give the rest away. The next morning, I signed the final set of papers. The Eleanor Thorne Foundation would no longer bear my name. It would be renamed the Clara Project, a tribute not just to her survival, but to the thousands of other girls whose names were never printed, whose stories were never heard. The house, the last of my estate, was gifted to the organization. It would become a retreat. A refuge. A place where survivors could come to heal, to write, to remember. I didn't need a legacy. I needed a legacy to mean something. Clara asked if I'd stay involved. I will, I said. For as long as I can. And when I no longer could, I trusted she would carry it forward. Not in my shadow, but in her light. I don't know when the end will come. I don't fear it, because I've already made peace with the past. I've already spoken what needed to be said. I've already looked into the eyes of the girl I once was and whispered, we made it. And more than that, I looked into the eyes of another girl, a young woman named Emma, and passed the torch. She'll carry it farther than I ever could. Because that's the secret, isn't it? Survival isn't about holding on. It's about passing it on. If you're hearing my voice now, it's because someone like Emma listened. Someone like Clara survived. And someone like you, yes, you, still has a decision to make. To speak. To see. To remember. And never again, to stay silent. Here the story ends. Thanks for watching. Hit like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more true tales and real stories.